The war in Ukraine rages on, and day after day we're inundated with new images, videos of the destruction, but also of military operations, amateur footage showing the day-to-day on the ground for troops and for civilians on both sides. But for anyone who doesn't understand Russian or Ukrainian, you're soon lost in the flood of material. Enter Dmitri, a 32-year-old marketing professional who understands both languages. He's made it his mission to translate as much war-related material as possible into English. And every day he makes scores of videos, Telegram and blog entries available to a wider Western public. Dmitri goes only by his first name, and he's joining me now from London. So thanks for taking the time to speak with me, Dmitri. Welcome.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, your website is called wartranslated.com. Tell us, what made you decide to provide this service? What was the actual starting point?
Sure. So the starting point was rather accidental. So as millions of people around the world were watching things starting to unfold on the 24th of February last year. So I was looking on Twitter, on YouTube, and just trying to find information and videos about what was happening, because obviously it was a major global event with so many people from around the world tuning in. And Twitter is my go-to platform, social media for finding information and just being around on the internet. I found it very convenient. And what I found is that as I was watching, various videos in the first few days, a lot of them started coming through, mainly combat videos, but also a lot of, horrifying footage that we have seen, but also sometimes occasionally footage that shows certain defiance of the people defending their homeland. But what happened was a couple of them, I saw that people weren't really understanding what was being said in Ukrainian or Russian language. So I simply went and translated the video in a text file, just took a screenshot and posted under the comment under those videos in the comment section. And a couple of them have done quite well. So they have sort of, gone viral, you could say. I've had some videos, or translations rather, with 5,000 likes in the first few days, while my account was very small on Twitter at the time. I wasn't anything to speak of, to be honest. It was nothing special at all. But essentially what happened was, I started doing that more and more. And every single day I started sitting, and I realized there was some appetite for what I'm doing, essentially. And I've also noticed no one else was doing that. So I just kept going and going and going, and due to the free time I have, I happen to be doing that quite a lot, to be honest. So a year later, here we are.
Here we are, and now you have over 310,000 followers on Twitter, with many journalists and obviously some major media outlets among your followers. But who, as far as you can tell, is otherwise? Who is your main audience?
Sure. So essentially, I think that my main audience, obviously, are the people who are watching, or regular, ordinary people who want to stay in touch with what is happening on the front lines. I would say, age-wise, it's obviously a slightly older audience. I think the average age, I don't really have the exact numbers, but I would imagine it's somewhere around 40, 50 years old. These are the people who are highly engaged with what is happening around the world, and with politics, with news. And they are definitely, looking at what is happening, especially people in Europe. They're looking at what's happening right next to them, and they want to know more. But due to the language barrier, they're unable to understand what is happening. But also having some, traffic data from my website, I know a lot of people are watching from the US. For example, I think about 25% of the people on my website are coming from the United States, and also from all around the world, really, from Japan, all kinds of countries around the world. But these are just really highly engaged people.
And how surprised were you, Dmitri, at the reception that you got, at the actual demand that's out there for this information?
Well, I wouldn't say it's very surprising. So what surprised me the most is that no one else is doing it, out of so many people who can. But I guess it just comes down to, who I am, and what I'm interested in naturally as a person, and the languages I speak, and the interest in that area of the world as well. So that was the most surprising thing, I would say. But yes, I still sometimes really, think, how is it possible that I gained so many followers and just such a huge viewing in such a short period of time. But I think it comes down to the fact that I just produce something that no one else does, essentially.
Let's get back to those two languages that you speak and your relationship to these two languages, because you were born in Estonia and grew up there as part of the Russian minority. Is that correct? Tell us about that.
Yeah, essentially. As I was growing up, we've always known that we called ourselves Russian, essentially, because in school we spoke Russian. All of our parents spoke Russian. They were, it was such a common thing. You never really even thought about it as you were growing up. But because I've been living in the UK for many years now, I have command, obviously, of both languages. So it just happened to be that I've kind of, learned Ukrainian, at least to understand what's being said in the past year, although it's quite a complicated language, but, knowing Russian made it a little bit easier. But yes, in Estonia, there's a large Russian-speaking minority, but you don't really think about it as you're living in it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. You do have a Russian mother and a Ukrainian father, and understanding both languages and knowing both countries. I'm just wondering, how was it for you when the war broke out? I mean, how conflicted were you in just seeing what was happening there?
It hasn't really started for me in 2022. I've been following the events since 2013, 2014, when the Maidan revolution happened, and probably even going back to 2004 when the Orange Revolution was happening in Ukraine. Although I was very small, I was still really aware of what was happening back then. But people like me, and the Russian minority in Estonia, we have various backgrounds, and to be honest, a lot of the time we don't even distinguish between someone's parents coming from Russia or Ukraine. It was all quite, or Armenia or Georgia, so it was quite mixed, to be honest. But it's just the one thing that sort of united them is the ability to speak Russian widely between us, really. So coming back to your original question, it's definitely the fact itself that it started on such a scale definitely was shocking to me. I wasn't believing it as much, but the war has been going on for a while. It's been going on for almost 10 years now.
Indeed, that is something that always comes up in these conversations, and I should have realized that. You still take no money for this service, and you post all of your translations for free. What would you say is your main motivation now?
Well, I do get donations, don't get me wrong, but there is nothing that pays me on a day-to-day basis. So it's extremely unpredictable, and it's not the main thing that I'm looking for. But what motivates me is just my background, I suppose. I've been into military history since childhood. My education from the university is in politics, international relations. So military history, politics have always been on my mind. And especially when you combine that plus the fact that there's such a huge scale event is happening right next to me, and with the people from whom I draw my heritage, it just all comes together. But then again, even otherwise, I would still be watching what is happening right now, even if I wasn't doing any translations. It's just that I can also provide some kind of a service to people, I suppose. And at the same time, I love social media, so having a certain following is also kind of nice to have as well. So although, to be honest, I try to avoid expressing my obvious opinions too much.
So tell me, where do you primarily look for and find your material?
So this has changed quite a bit, but the main primary source for information has obviously been Telegram, which is a Russian social network, but is also being used by people from around the world. But it's quite heavily, I would say, Russian or Ukrainian language speaking. So that there's also YouTube. For example, a lot of military units, they have their own YouTube channels that they put a lot of information on it, and great videos and great content that I sometimes translate. But there is also, there are some websites, blog posts. So it has evolved. My sources have evolved over time. And there's a couple of Twitter accounts that are really helpful as well.
And meanwhile, of course, you don't just translate, but you also try to give a platform to important Ukrainian voices that you consider important. What type of material has priority, or how do you prioritize those entries?
Well, actually, my again that evolved as well. What I'm trying to do is create good content that gives people an understanding of what is happening, and there are a lot of items and news items provided by the media, created by the media. They're really sophisticated. Often they use a lot of research, but I try to act as a sort of a primary resource or a primary source rather, where I will find something, I will translate it, I will put it out there, and you can do whatever you want with it. So as you mentioned before, for me, putting any sort of limits on who can use my content in their media kind of defeats the purpose of it. So it wouldn't make sense for me to actually charge money for that. So that's why I don't even ask really to credit me. But I know that so many resources, YouTubers use my materials. I've lost count of the places I've seen it at.
And do you have any kind of metric to tell you what kind of information gets the most resonance on your site?
Well, I mean, obviously, there are traditional social media metrics on Twitter, such as engagement, likes, and impressions. But I just have a natural sort of inclination to find good content. I know that when things can go viral, usually, obviously, these things that, as I said, they resonate with people, so they're kind of emotional, or they provide some kind of a unique look, or it can be something like combat footage, or it can be operation for military people. Some very interesting things, for example, are various weapons that are being used and how they're being deployed. So people really like watching this, but they may not understand what the people using them are actually saying. So there's a lot of things and that as well that evolved a lot during throughout the conflict as well.
And what's the balance of Ukrainian and Russian material that you translate, would you say?
Well, actually, I would say it's about 50-50. It's just we have to keep in mind, obviously, that a lot of the Russian content I'm translating, it's aimed towards showing the things how they're working internally. So if they're having some kind of a problems or they're saying something that is not available to the wider Western audience, that's what I'm trying to show, because people will not go to a Russian-speaking Telegram with 30 channels with sometimes really obscure small journalists and try to navigate enormous amounts of information. I can do that because of my ability, and I can put that forward. For Ukrainian content, I would say mostly what I'm trying to do is just really footage that shows courage and some really emotional events, things like that, or again using certain weapons. But the operational information that is happening within the ranks, I normally try to avoid that if possible. So because I don't want to jeopardize anyone.
Okay, and yet your stance is clearly pro-Ukrainian. Have you had any backlash from Russians, I'm wondering?
Oh, of course I've had, but I've had my position is not so much Ukrainian, but more so my values oriented towards the West. They have always been, and since perhaps I figured out my specific views when I was maybe 19, 20 years old, and since then it's been very stable, and that it just naturally happens that I choose a certain side in this conflict. But I wouldn't say that I'm at least before the conflict, even the 2013 when it began, or 14, I was staunchly anti-Russia or anything like that. I've had a lot of friends and connections there, so it's very unfortunate that what is happening right now is indeed happening. But my values dictate me which side I'm on, essentially.
Social media channels are, of course, as you know well, flooded with disinformation. How do you go about distinguishing or making sure that something is genuine? I'm thinking, for instance, on your site, instances like the Russian phone calls that were intercepted and published by Ukrainian intelligence. How can you be sure of their credibility?
I'm never sure. Sometimes I think that at the beginning I was thinking that they were all legitimate, but I'm not saying that they're not right now. But they often provide such a limited amount of information without any further detail that they're not really valuable anymore. They might have been at the very beginning for more so for motivational purposes, but at the moment I don't think they're valuable. When it comes to everything else, you have it's important to remember I'm not a journalist. I'm not working. I'm not creating stories. I'm not creating opinions. I'm not doing a lot of research. I act as a primary source. So I found something online, I translate it, I post it, and you decide what you want to do with it. That takes off certain responsibility for me to make sure that the information is correct. Of course, I will go and make sure that the wording is fine, the numbers are correct, but it's all very sort of minor fact checking, I would say. It's not super important. There are way more experienced people that can understand and interpret information that I'm providing, which is, I think, again, few do what I do.
Mm-hmm. So anyone using your information has to take that caveat into consideration. Dmitri, with everything that you read, with everything that you see, what new insights have you gained into the two countries, into the Russian and Ukrainian people that you maybe didn't have before you got involved to this level in this long-standing war, as you've mentioned?
Well, I've definitely learned way more about Ukraine than I used to. I mean, I've been to Ukraine before, but it's never been such a huge interest for me as a country. Not more than another country, for example. But I've learned to as I've learned, especially the language, especially how to understand it and how people speak. I've realized Ukraine is incredibly pro-Western or Western-like country. I find so many characteristics that I can find here in the United Kingdom among people, for example, which for me was very surprising compared to people in Russia, because I've known people in Russia quite well and know their mentality, and they are completely opposite. So Ukrainians' mentality is very, sort of, you could say, Republican. They know they're a nation. Russian mentality is much more imperialistic is the word to use, really, but it's much more expanding and ever expanding. But Ukrainian is certainly more like the UK and Estonia in how they communicate with each other. So that's something I've come to realize, and it actually makes me feel quite good that I found out about it. But with Russia, it was a bit more clear to me how they used to be. All pretty much, it's been clear for me for a long time, really.
Now, finally, you are now spending literally hours every day translating and dealing with a lot of this material. So you're exposed to a lot of violent and traumatic images at the same time. I'm just wondering, how difficult is that? Can you carry on, or is this going to take a toll on your mental health at all? What's your prognosis for how long you can carry on?
I don't really have any problems with it. I suppose maybe it's something to do with the upbringing with the internet, or maybe being exposed to violent games, video games. I don't really know. Maybe it's something to do with my family, really, but with my sort of heritage. But I don't really have a lot of problems. There is certain content that I do not really like watching, especially it comes to when innocent people are suffering who cannot do anything about it. Military is one thing. People who are, like in their old age, for example, children, when they are suffering and they cannot do anything about it, that's what I struggle with. So I rarely look at that type of content. So there's, I filter things quite a lot as well. So, but anything else is not that big of a deal for me. I don't know why, but it is what it is, really.
A lot of tough material, but certainly giving us great insight into what is actually going on for people on the ground in Ukraine and also in Russia. Keep up the great work, and thanks very much for taking the time, Dmitri.